They marched around the city and said nothing. Not a battle cry, not a war chant, not the kind of shouting an army makes when it wants to demonstrate its strength to the enemy watching from the walls above. They walked in silence, priests in front, blowing ram's horn trumpets. The Ark of the Covenant carried on the shoulders of the Levites. The army of Israel surrounding it all, weapons in hand, moving in a circle around the walls of Jericho and then going back to camp. No attack, no siege equipment, no attempt on the gate, just a slow, silent, inexplicable circle. And then they left. And they came back the next morning and did it again. The same circle, the same silence, the same trumpets, the same ark, the same army walking the perimeter of a city that had shut its gates and was watching from the top of walls that had stood for generations. 6 days, 6 circles, 6 mornings of the most baffling military maneuver in recorded history, watched from above by a city full of people who had every reason to be afraid and were now, perhaps, also becoming confused, because on the 7th morning, they came back again. But this time, they didn't stop after 1 circle. They kept going, 7 times around the walls of Jericho, the priests blowing the whole way, and then Joshua gave the signal, and the entire nation of Israel, the priests, the army, the hundreds of thousands of people who had crossed the Jordan River and were camping in the Promised Land for the first time, they opened their mouths and shouted, and the walls fell down. Not a section, not a gate. The entire wall, the outer wall, the wall that had been so thick that people built houses in it, the wall that represented everything a city could do to protect itself from siege, came down, flat, to the ground. No battering ram, no sappers undermining the foundation, no army that had figured out the structural weakness. Just sound, just the human voice, multiplied by hundreds of thousands, released after 6 days of total silence. And a city that had been impregnable for generations was open. How did this happen? Why did it happen this way? And what does a wall that falls to a shout have to say about the way God works in history and in the specific, difficult, impenetrable walls of your own life right now? Stay with me. To feel the full weight of what happened at Jericho, you have to feel the weight of everything that came before it. 40 years, an entire generation. The people of Israel had spent 40 years in the wilderness between Egypt and the land they had been promised. 40 years of manna falling each morning and water coming from rocks and sandals that somehow never wore out. 40 years of God's visible, tangible, daily provision. And also 40 years of waiting, of circling, of being so close to the fulfillment of the promise that they could sometimes probably see the hills of Canaan in the distance, and yet the Jordan had not been crossed. The generation that left Egypt was gone. The men who had stood at the edge of the Promised Land 40 years earlier, who had heard the spies' report of a land flowing with milk and honey, and also a land of walled cities and giants, who had chosen fear over faith and turned back into the wilderness. Those men were dead. Their wives, their children who had been too young to bear any responsibility for that decision, those people were still alive, now grown, now middle-aged, now the people who would actually cross the Jordan and take what had been promised. Joshua had been waiting his whole adult life for this. He had been one of the 2 spies, alongside Caleb, who had argued 40 years ago that the land was takeable, that the God who had parted the Red Sea could certainly handle the walls and the giants. He had been overruled then. He had spent 40 years in the wilderness with everyone else, waiting, watching the generation that had refused die off one by one, and now he was the leader. Moses was dead. The mantle had passed, and the Jordan was in front of him, and Jericho was on the other side of it. The Jordan River crossing was its own miracle. The waters piling up upstream, the priests carrying the ark standing in the middle of the dry riverbed, while all of Israel crossed over on dry ground, a deliberate echo of the Red Sea crossing that was probably not lost on anyone old enough to have heard the stories. A new generation, a new crossing, a new threshold, and then they were in the land. And the first thing they encountered was Jericho. Jericho already knew they were coming. The book of Joshua records something that is easy to miss in the rush to get to the wall collapse, something that matters enormously for understanding the full picture of what was happening. By the time Israel crossed the Jordan, the psychological damage had already been done. Rahab, the woman who would play a crucial role in this story, told the two spies that Joshua had sent ahead. "I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you." Melt away. That is a specific phrase describing a specific internal experience. The people of Jericho were not calmly preparing their defenses, confident in their walls. They were already melting, already feeling that particular dread that comes when you realize the outcome of a confrontation may already be determined. Rahab went further. She told the spies exactly what had been happening inside the city for 40 years. Since the Exodus, we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For 40 years, the people of Jericho had been carrying this knowledge, that somewhere in the wilderness, the people whose God had parted the Red Sea were circling, waiting, growing. For 40 years, the story had been in the air. What happened to Egypt, what the God of Israel was capable of, what the Israelites were moving toward. For 40 years, Jericho had been afraid. And now Israel was on the other side of the Jordan, and Jericho shut its gates. Now Jericho was shut up inside and outside because of the people of Israel. None went out and none came in. The city was locked. No commerce, no communication, no movement in or out. A city trying to become invisible, trying to wait out an army it already believed would defeat it. This is the context in which the instruction was given. If this story is already pulling you in, if you can feel the weight of 40 years of waiting and the locked gates of the first obstacle, subscribe right now. Because what God told Joshua to do next is one of the most psychologically precise strategies in the entire Bible. Joshua received his orders from an unexpected source the night before the campaign against Jericho began. He was near Jericho, probably scouting, taking stock, doing what a military commander does before a significant engagement, when he looked up and saw a man standing before him with a drawn sword. Joshua went toward him and asked the question any military commander would ask in that situation. Are you for us or for our adversaries? The answer was neither. The man identified himself as the commander of the army of the Lord, and he had not come for Joshua's side or against it. He had simply come. Joshua fell on his face and asked, "What does my Lord say to his servant? Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." The burning bush, the same instruction given to Moses in the same posture of encounter. Take off your sandals. This ground is different from ordinary ground. Before you receive the strategy, before you get the battle plan, acknowledge where you are and who you are standing in front of. Joshua took off his sandals, and then the Lord spoke to him. The text shifts from the commander figure to the Lord directly, without clear demarcation, and gave him the plan for Jericho. March around the city once a day for 6 days. 7 priests carrying 7 trumpets of ram's horn are to march before the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times, and the priests are to blow the trumpets. And when they blow a long blast with the ram's horn, when you hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat. Joshua heard this plan and did not object. He did not ask for clarification about the siege equipment he would need or the structural analysis that explained why this would work, or the tactical backup plan if the shout failed to bring down the wall. He received the instruction and he went back to the camp, and he told the people what was going to happen. "You shall not shout or make your voice heard, neither shall any word go out of your mouth until the day I tell you to shout. Then you shall shout 6 days of silence. No one was to make a sound, no speaking, no calling out, no rallying cries. The only sounds permitted were the priestly trumpets, the ram's horns, the blast that in Israel signaled not music, but divine presence, the sound associated with the approach of God rather than the approach of an army. Walk, be silent, let the trumpets speak, wait." No. The first morning Israel marched out, the army in front, then the priests with the trumpets, then the ark carried on the shoulders of the Levites, the gold-covered chest that represented the presence of God among his people, moving toward the walls of Jericho. Then more soldiers following, and they walked around the city. Once, the whole circuit, and the walls of Jericho watched. What did the people of Jericho see from those walls? An army, yes, a large one, moving in a formation that made no obvious military sense. No battering rams, no siege towers, no attempt on the gate, just walking, and the sound of trumpets, and silence except for the trumpets. The silence may have been the strangest part. An army that has come to fight is not a quiet army. It announces itself. It tries to intimidate, to demoralize, to demonstrate its size and aggression through noise and display. This army was silent, moving methodically around the walls, blowing ram's horns, carrying a box on poles, and then going back to camp. The second day, the same. The third, the fourth. And something was happening. Not to the walls, not yet, but inside the people of both cities, in the space between the walls and the watching. On the Jericho side, what do you do with an enemy that marches around your walls and leaves? The military response playbook has no entry for this. You cannot attack a retreating army effectively from inside a walled city. You cannot negotiate with an army that isn't communicating. You cannot read the intention of a force that moves silently, circles once, and returns to camp. The strategy was inaccessible to them because it was not any strategy they had a framework to understand. And on the Israel side, 6 days of trusting and instruction that produced no visible result. 6 mornings of rising, arming, marching, circling, returning to camp without anything having changed. 6 days of the wall still standing, still exactly as impregnable as it had been the morning before. The kind of faith that the 6 days required was not the easy faith of a prayer immediately answered. It was the accumulating, day-by-day, repetition faith of people who had been told what was going to happen and had to keep acting on that promise through 6 mornings, when the evidence of their eyes showed them nothing had changed. This is the faith the wilderness had been forming in them for 40 years. Not the faith of the dramatic moment, the crossing, the miracle, the immediate spectacular result, but the faith of the 7th day following the 6th, following the 5th. The faith that shows up on the days when nothing has happened yet, and the instruction says, keep going anyway. On the 7th day, they got up at dawn. This detail, the dawn start, specifically noted by the text, suggests that the 7th day was going to be longer than the previous 6. One circuit took some period of time. 7 circuits would take roughly 7 times as long. They started at first light because they needed the time. 7 times around the walls of Jericho. The same formation, the same priests, the same trumpets, the same silence from the people. But now the circuits multiplied. The priests blowing continuously. The ark moving again and again around the perimeter of a city that must, by this point, have been in a state of utter disorientation about what was happening. By the 7th circuit of the 7th day, the army of Israel had walked around the walls of Jericho 13 times total. The soldiers who had marched every day for a week in the Canaan sun were tired. Their feet knew the circuit. They could have walked it in their sleep. And then Joshua spoke. For the first time since he had given the original instruction to be silent, he spoke to the army. Shout! For the Lord has given you the city. And then, in the breath before the shout, he gave instructions that told the army exactly how this victory was to be treated. The city and everything in it was devoted to destruction. The silver and gold and vessels of bronze and iron were sacred to the Lord and would go into his treasury. But one woman, one household, one family on a wall was to be kept alive. Rahab, the woman who had hidden the spies, the woman who had tied a scarlet thread in her window as the sign of her protection, the woman who, in the middle of a city already melting with fear, had made a bet on the God of Israel and the people who served him. Her household would be preserved. Everyone else in the city, the text is explicit about this, and it is one of the hard passages in the book of Joshua that honest readers cannot pass over without wrestling with. Everyone else was devoted to destruction. Joshua finished speaking, and the priests blew the trumpets, and all the people shouted with a great shout. It fell. The text says simply, and the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they captured the city flat, not breached. not crumbled in one section. Flat, the entire outer wall of Jericho lying on the ground. Every man going straight into the city from wherever he was standing in the circle, because there was no longer any barrier between where he stood and the interior of the city. The archaeology of Jericho has been one of the most debated topics in biblical archaeology for over a century, with various excavations at Tel-e-Sultan, the site traditionally identified as ancient Jericho, producing evidence that has been interpreted in different ways by different scholars. There is evidence of a significant destruction at the site in the late Bronze Age. There is evidence of mud brick walls that collapsed outward rather than inward, which would correspond to what the text describes. The dating questions remain the subject of ongoing scholarly debate, but the story is not primarily interested in providing a seismological or structural account of why the wall fell. It is interested in the sequence. The promise was given, the instruction was followed for 7 days, the shout was given, and the wall fell. The connection the text draws is explicit and non-incidental. The wall fell in response to the shout of the people following 7 days of faithful, silent marching, following an instruction that made no conventional military sense. Whatever the mechanism, and the text does not attempt to explain the mechanism, which is itself a kind of theological statement, the collapse was the fulfillment of the promise. I have given you Jericho, not I will give you Jericho, contingent on the walls falling. The promise was stated in the past tense as a completed fact before a single march had begun. I have given. The future was spoken of as though it had already happened, because from the perspective of the one making the promise, it had. The 7 days of marching were not the condition of the promise. They were the people's participation in the fulfillment of something that had already been determined. They were walking toward an outcome that was already guaranteed, in the only way they could walk toward it. One circle at a time, in silence, with ram's horn trumpets and the Ark of the Covenant and the specific daily discipline of trusting what they had been told. Comment below right now. What are you walking around? What wall have you been circling day after day with nothing visibly changing? But you keep going because you were told to? Tell us, because the silence before the shout is part of the strategy. But before the city fell, before the shouting, before any of the 7 days of marching, 2 spies had spent a night in a house on the Wall of Jericho. And in that house lived a woman named Rahab. She was a prostitute. The text identifies her this way plainly, without apology, and without making it the central fact about her. She is identified by her occupation, her location, and her action. And the action is what the story is actually about. She hid the spies. She knew who they were and why they were there, and what the arrival of Israel outside the Jordan meant for her city. She had heard the stories, 40 years of stories about the God of Israel, from Egypt to the wilderness, and she had come to a conclusion that the rest of her city had also come to, but that she acted on differently. The rest of Jericho melted. Rahab made a deal. I know that the Lord has given you this land. The fear of you has fallen upon us. For the Lord your God, He is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. She said this to 2 Israelite spies hiding in her house. She said it at risk to herself. The king of Jericho had sent men looking for the spies, and she had lied to protect them, sending the king's men in the wrong direction. Her protection of them was an act of genuine loyalty, at real personal cost, and she asked for something specific in return. When the city falls, spare me and my family. My father, my mother, my brothers, my sisters. Everyone in this house. The spies agreed. They gave her a sign. Tie a scarlet thread in the window through which you let us down. And make sure everyone who needs to be saved is inside the house when it happens. A scarlet thread. Red cord in a window. One household set apart within the devoted city, not by any merit that distinguished Rahab from her neighbors, not by any claim on Israel's loyalty that predated her decision to hide the spies, but by the simple, specific act of choosing the right side in the moment when the choice was available to her. On the day the wall fell, the text tells us Joshua gave specific instruction. Bring out Rahab and all who are with her, as you swore to her. And they did. Her household was brought out. The family she had gathered inside the house with the scarlet thread, and placed outside the camp of Israel, safe, alive, the only survivors of Jericho. Rahab later appears in the genealogy of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. A Canaanite woman from a city devoted to destruction, who tied a scarlet thread in her window, became part of the ancestral line of the one who would ultimately fulfill everything the Promised Land was pointing toward. The scarlet thread in the window of a house on a wall that fell, and a woman who, when the city melted around her, had chosen not to melt. 6 days of silence. This is the part of the Jericho story that never gets as much attention as the wall falling. And it may be the most important part, because the shout was not the whole strategy. The silence was also the strategy. The commanded, disciplined 7-day silence was doing something that the shout could not have done on its own. Think about what the silence communicated to the people of Jericho. An army that marches around your walls and says nothing is an army that is not trying to intimidate you through noise. An army that returns day after day without attacking is an army operating on a timeline that has nothing to do with your ability to resist. The silence said, we are not here on our own agenda. We are following an instruction. The instruction has a time frame, and the time frame is not negotiable by your response. And think about what the silence did to the people of Israel. 6 days of marching without speaking forced 6 days of the most intensive internal engagement with the mission imaginable. When you cannot speak, you think. When the only sound permitted is the sound of the ram's horns, the sound specifically associated with the presence and approach of God, your mind has no choice but to stay with the reality of what you are doing and why. You are walking in circles around an impregnable city. You have been told the wall will fall. Nothing has happened yet. The wall is still there, and you cannot talk about it, cannot fill the silence with conversation, with question, with the mutual reassurance and collective doubt that talking in groups always produces. You can only walk and listen to the trumpets and carry the thing that represents the presence of the one who gave the instruction. 6 days of being unable to process this communally forced 6 days of processing it individually. And what comes out of that kind of sustained internal engagement, for some people at least, is a faith that is no longer dependent on the conversation. That has moved from the head to the body, from the spoken to the embodied, from something you assent to intellectually to something you actually believe in your muscles and your feet, and the part of you that keeps walking on the sixth day when nothing has changed. The silence formed the faith that the shout required, because the shout, the great shout of the seventh day, had to be a real shout, not a performative shout, not a ritual noise made because the instructions said to make noise. A shout from people who had walked 7 times around the walls, and who, in that seventh circuit of the seventh day, actually believed the thing they had been told. The wall will fall. You cannot fake that shout. You can fake a ritual noise. But the great shout of Jericho, the one the text says brought the wall down, that was the shout of a people who had walked themselves over 7 days and 13 circuits into genuine belief. The wall of Jericho did not fall to battering rams. It did not fall to a superior military force, a clever undermining of the foundations, or a negotiated surrender. It fell to a sound. And specifically, it fell to a sound that came at the end of 7 days of silence. This sequence, the silence that prepared and the sound that released, is not incidental. It is the shape of what the whole story has been building toward. And it has a resonance that extends far beyond the specific walls of ancient Jericho. Because every one of us has walls. Not the mud brick outer wall of a Bronze Age city, but the various structures that have been built by circumstance, by other people, by our own history and fear, and the accumulated weight of what we have been told is impossible, around the things we most need to reach. The relationship that seems permanently frozen, the habit that has resisted every previous attempt to break it. The door that appears locked from the other side. The future that seems sealed by the past. These are the walls that the Jericho story speaks to. And what the story says about them is not simple or easy or immediately encouraging, because it says you may have to walk around this wall in silence for a while before the shout is available. The shout is not the beginning. The silence is the beginning. The daily, disciplined, non-dramatic act of continuing to follow the instruction even when nothing visible has changed. That is the beginning. The first circle, and the second, and the third through sixth, all of which looked exactly like the first. And on the seventh day, in the seventh circuit, something has been built in you that was not there on the first morning. A faith that has been walked into your body. An obedience that has become so integrated into who you are in this moment that when the signal finally comes, the shout that comes out of you is real. Because the wall does not fall to a ritual noise. It falls to a people who have walked far enough around it, in silence, to actually believe it will. After the wall fell, after the city was taken, after the silver and gold had been gathered for the treasury, and Rahab's household had been brought to safety, Joshua spoke a curse over Jericho. Cursed before the Lord be the man who rises up and rebuilds this city, Jericho. The city was not to be rebuilt, not because its location was strategically worthless. It was not. But because Jericho was the first fruits of the promised land, and the first fruits belonged to God. Jericho was not Israel's prize. It was God's statement about who the land belonged to and who was giving it. The wall fell and Jericho stayed fallen as a testimony, a ruin that would stand for generations as the answer to anyone who asked how Israel entered the land and who gave it to them. Not by our military superiority, not by our numbers or our strategy or our siege equipment, by a shout. After 7 days of silence, after 40 years of waiting, after 400 years of slavery in Egypt and the wilderness and the generations of promise stretching back to Abraham, the wall falling was the culmination of a promise made to one man with no land, no descendants yet, standing under the stars. To your offspring I will give this land. From Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, to the 12 tribes, to the wilderness generation, to this moment, standing inside the promised land for the first time, with the dust of Jericho's walls settling around them. The promise had always been true. The timing of its fulfillment was not in Israel's control. The method of its fulfillment was not in Israel's design. They were participants in something that had been determined long before they were born, playing their role, the 7 days, the silence, the shout, in a story that was much larger than any of them. And the wall fell, not because they deserved the land, not because they had earned it, through the quality of their faith or the purity of their obedience. The wall fell because the one who had said, "I have given you Jericho," was the kind of God who means what he says. The same God whose word created the walls in the first place. The same God who made the stone and the mud brick and the knowledge of how to build with them. The same God who, when the moment came, did not need a battering ram or a siege tower or a clever general. He needed 7 days of silent marching and one great shout, and the wall had no answer for that. Neither does yours. If this story reached something in you today, if you recognized your own walls, your own 7 days of silent marching, your own moment of waiting for the shout, please share this video with one person who is on day 4 or 5 of their circuit, wondering if anything is going to change. Leave a comment below. Tell us your Jericho, the wall you've been circling. Tell us how many days you've been walking. Comment, "The wall will fall." If you believe today that what has been promised will be fulfilled in the way and the timing that was always planned, subscribe. Because every story in this series is about the gap between the promise and the fulfillment, and the people who kept walking in the silence until the shout was ready. The wall is already falling, you just haven't heard the sound yet.